Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And we've just come back from the Mac where you've seen Bait.
Yes.
Which is a British film set in Cornwall, made in Cornwall about a modern day Cornish fisherman. I think this is from the press kit. This is on the BFI's website. This is just a short statement about what the film is, which I think sums it up quite nicely.
Okay.
Modern day Cornish fisherman Martin, played by Edward Rowe, is struggling to buy a boat while coping with family rivalry and the influx of London money, Airbnb and stag parties to his harbour village. The summer season brings simmering tensions between locals and newcomers to a boiling point, with tragic consequences. Okay, so what did you make of it?
I liked it very much. We saw it in a cinema that was pretty packed.
Yeah, very, very full.
And I think the audience responded to everything. And it was actually quite interesting to see an audience respond to what is really an experimental film. Yeah, it's in black and white. The narrative is quite loose. It has all of these montage sequences. It uses a lot of symbolism. So, to have an audience kind of fully engaged with that was very, very pleasing. So, I enjoyed all of that. And I think the film is an important film. It's very rare in British cinema that you see something from the point of view of the subaltern that seems as knowledgeable and as familiar with that way of life as this film is. It's all shot from this fisherman who no longer even have a place kind of fishing in their own ancestral village, who are kind of further and further marginalized. So the fact that it's shot from their point of view is to me important. And the way that it's shot is kind of, really interesting and intriguing. I think it's a film that I think has been overpraised.
Okay.
Yeah. And that due to it being overpraised, it perhaps risks having a longer life than it deserves to have. I think it's a film that deserves to have a longer life. I think if people come, like Mark Kermode saying it's the best British film of the decade, it's, to me, such an overstatement.
Might be overdoing it a little bit.
Do
you think there's an element in that of saying, if I say I like this so much, that will prove I'm smart? I think there might be a feeling about that. I mean, I do think it's a really good, interesting film.
Yes.
And ridiculously atmospheric.
Yes.
I mean, it reminded me of, put me in mind of Eraserhead, the David Lynch film, in the use, not just the black and white visuals, which obviously are kind of, that shares a certain similarity there, but the soundtrack.
All right.
There's constant noise going on,
okay.
And you can normally explain where it's coming from. It's the hum of a boat or something like that, but it's loud and kind of oppressive, and you feel that visually. There's also a concentration on manual labour, hands, ropes, things being cut, or kind of you'll get very simple shots. So a shot will be kind of empty, and then someone will bring a lobster trap into the shot, and that's just the entire shot.
Yes.
And there's a lot of things like that where it's just these concentrations on little individual movements and things.
Yes, I loved all of that. I loved the focus on manual labor, and I loved also the way that the film underlines the difficult skills involved. So there's quite I suppose an extended shot of just a knot being tied, and kind of what this particular knot can do and how complicated it is, and yet how beautiful and elegant, and in a way it looks so simple, but it's like a knot that has like 8 different knotted bits or something. I love all of that, actually.
The thing I like most about the film is the kind of emotional legibility of the main character.
Yes.
You absolutely understand kind of where he comes from and who he is and what he hates about the way his community and part of the world is changing.
Yes.
And he feels it's being invaded.
Yes.
So very early on, it's established that this house that used to live in it's got a name. It's a house with a name, but it's like Seaman's Cottage or something. I can't remember what the thing is, but it's basically where he lived. with his brother, and it's where he grew up, because they talk about his mum's pantry having been destroyed by these people that they sold it to, who are very middle class people who come in there, and he calls them tourists. I mean, very, very straight up. This guy's trying to defend why he's there and this sort of thing, and he's just going, "You're a tourist, you're a tourist, you're a tourist," in one of the best scenes of the film, I think. And so he feels, this place is being gentrified. I'm losing my place here. There's this thing about he sold the house to the people, and the wife says, no one forced you to sell this house to us. We didn't force you to sell this house to us. And he says, didn't you? Wasn't I forced? Basically means he was. He had no choice but to sell this thing, and he's saving up money in a tin to buy a boat so he can then go off and make more money fishing.
Yeah, which suggests various things. He'll never get a boat. I mean, it's not through the money that you can accumulate on a tin that you're going to be able to buy a boat. Except
he does right at the end. He does.
I thought that was his brother's boat.
Doesn't he buy it off him? Isn't that what it was? I thought that's what it was.
Okay.
Perhaps neither of us is.
I'm not clear on that.
Perhaps neither of us is that clear. I thought that's what it was.
To me, the whole thing suggests, because what you see in that tin is maybe like 150 quid or something, right? Like, it's £5 notes and a few £20 notes, and
I was probably a couple of hundred in there, but
a couple of hundred to buy a.
Well, maybe it's a down payment. I mean, maybe it's a deposit. And you go out and make more money.
To me, the fact that you're saving money on a tin,
I quite agree.
It suggests that you're not going to buy a boat, or that it's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, I found that I am. But again, I never understand this about British culture, so just bear with me, because that was a thing that I just don't understand. I think, from my culture, it's true. You sell it, you sell it. Kind of what do you mean you didn't have to, or you presumably got like really good money for it, right? Like kind of you didn't have to. So kind of so this resentment against the people who bought it from you when in fact you sold it. I mean, I just don't understand it. I don't.
I do agree with that. I think, or maybe there's an element of not having enough of that backstory to understand why he sold it. Because when he says, essentially, I did have to sell this house, you don't understand why. You don't understand if he was hard up for money or anything like that.
But also, I think if you're hard up for money and lucky you to be able to have a house to sell. I mean, other people don't have anything to sell, so you sold it. I mean, it was, kind of, and presumably they're now living in council housing, that there's a little row of houses or something. I mean, kind of, when one thinks of all the horrible things that are going on in the world, to me it feels quite lucky that you have a house to sell, and that you have a place to live still, right? Which is things that you see in the film. So, I do understand, why people would be resentful of rich people who come in, throw money around, are completely oblivious to the way of life.
Claim that they're then part of the community because they now live here.
Yeah,
that they haven't earned.
I get all of that. But this particular resentment to the people who happen to buy the house, I kind of...
Yeah.
I don't...
I agree. I understand it. I understand who this man is and why and where his resentment comes from. That's not to say I necessarily agree entirely with the resentment. I mean, this thing about him parking his car there still, and they're saying this is private property. I mean, it used to be yours, but it's not anymore. Can you please move your car? And he refuses to.
Yeah.
Is petty, really. It comes across to me as.
Yeah, and the film doesn't... I mean, you could imagine how that would be an emotional response anyway, and that it is unreasonable, but nonetheless it's an honest emotional response. I mean, there are gradations of subtlety that the film could have conveyed there, but that didn't come across to me.
Sure.
So, I mean, I suppose, I do think it's kind of an important film. And I do love, the way that it tries to render this person and this way of life and this argument poetically. And it largely succeeds, but it doesn't quite. And then when it does succeed, for me, it only succeeds on up to a particular level. The film that I kept comparing it to in my head was something like Luchino Visconti's La Terra Trama. And there's nothing as powerful or as poetic or as in that film. which is kind of like a neo-realist, semi-documentary take, on a way of life of these people. And of course, that's a large-scale film. It's about a whole way of life. I mean, this is much smaller scale and so on. But I suppose what I mean to say is that, though the film tries to be poetic, I found some of it quite heavy-handed, and then I didn't find the imagery as powerful or as moving, as I would have liked it to be. Which is not to say that it isn't good or that it doesn't work. I'm just kind of here talking about levels. Yeah. So, let's establish that it's an important film, and that it's a very good film, and it's a film that works with the audience. But I do think that kind of let's not blow it up sky high where, people are going to be disappointed. I think it's not, to me, on the level of the work of great filmmakers. I think it's, on the level of somebody who is cobbling together very interesting things and actually kind of speaking from a perspective that is still rare enough so that we need to hear it, so that audiences kind of need to hear it. And it has, kind of things that I do really love, like kind of, all of the imagery of, what is it, not a port, but, where there's a wall that almost covers the ocean and the tide comes in and out.
Yeah, it's the sort of dock, I suppose. I'm not sure if there's a better name for it. There must be, but it's essentially a dock where you're protected from the sea before you go out.
Yeah. So I love the way that so much of the film is framed by looking on the opening of that wall and what it shows you of the sea. I didn't like the way that the bourgeois tourist family was depicted. I thought it was very heavy-handed. Particularly the young man and the husband. I mean, I come from a village also where there's a lot of tourists, and I know some of the responses are like that. So, the feeling is like that, but it was way heavy-handed, I think.
It was, and they are caricatures, really. The daughter probably less so, probably least of all.
Yes.
But they are. It's got me thinking about kind of British sort of parochialism, because the film's attitude, I think, ultimately seems to be, these communities are worth protecting, and you can understand the resentment of people who were born and raised in these communities and are having them kind of feel like they're being kind of trampled on by these newcomers. But then that can be taken a sort of negative way, which is to say, just there's a real insularity to that, and say I don't want anyone else to come into my nice world the way I like it.
Also, life changes. I mean, to be honest, I am sympathetic, but I'm also unsympathetic. Again, I come from a farming family, small landholders in rural Spain. I mean, my God, the way of life, the way that it's changed in 40, 50 years. I mean, people have had to move into cities, and, communities have been decimated, or other people have adapted, kind of new agricultural methods to, a way of life that they used to have. I mean, I think this is a worldwide thing. It's not just a Cornish thing. So it's nice to get a Cornish perspective on it, right? But I think, for example, it would have been good, or the film would have been richer from having more of a perspective, or a wider perspective. How are other people in the community handling that change, right? So it's good to have the focus on two brothers, but maybe we could have met somebody in the pub who actually is running a very successful fishing business, or, I mean, I think if this is all the information that we get, right, about these two brothers, one who's had to transform the boat to a tourist attraction, right, and one who doesn't even have that and is just kind of, fishing on the beach with a net, right?
Yeah. And the middle class family that moves in really are basically just villains in this. Again, I would say with the exception of the daughter, who is shown to engage with a local.
I mean, the boy steals the lobsters, from the traps that are not his. The parents eat the lobster, as does the kid and his, tourist friends. So they're minor things, but actually they're completely a break with the conventions, an attack on conventions of the place. The mother tries to make up for it by giving some money, but but actually that's not the same as apologizing or punishing the child, or it's almost like, that money will solve the problem that they've caused. So I think there's an attempt to make them more rounded, but I don't think it's too successful.
No. But I suppose what I was trying to get to is that despite the fact that the kid steals these lobsters and the dad sort of wants to claim a kind of a part of the community that he hasn't earned by this point, because they've only just moved in. To me, they still don't come across as arrogant enough to sort of justify being seen as sort of villains entirely.
Yes.
They are newcomers. They bought a house. They don't seem to have, I don't know, like ulterior motives or something. Like they found a nice place in the world they like to live. Okay, and that obviously to the locals, or at least to this local, represents a disruption and a kind of unwelcome presence. But I don't think they come in with kind of their dick swinging out, going, right, we're here now. We're important.
I think in many ways, to be honest, I see it as a very conservative film. Just in the same way that in my own village, you see these same forces of what I call reaction, right? That, somehow, some people, A, they can't accept change, and B, they feel that somehow they have a God-given right to a particular way of life, and, and the response is, well, why? Why do you specifically have, some kind of sacred, a right to your way of life? Everybody else doesn't. It's not as, people in the cities have also been chased away from manufacturing or whatever. I mean, kind of, life keeps changing all the time. So, what is it about you? And this applies to farmers, which is, my family, in this case, fishermen. What is it about you that, like, kind of, your way of life has to be protected over those of other people's? What gives you a special right, to a piece of land and, and the way of life that goes along with it? I mean, if you can't make a go of it, why shouldn't you change like everybody else? Yeah,
and I was chatting to Mark Fuller a little bit, who gave us... He's seen the film a couple of times and he really loves it. Yes. So I asked him for one or two thoughts, and one of the things he mentioned was that after The Awful Fisherman Friends, which was that sort of music thing, we never saw it. That was out last year, I think. Cornish people hearing their own accent and slang on screen means such a lot to them, and they've really taken this film to their hearts. I think you can really understand why.
I understand that completely.
And I also understand kind of there is... I don't know much about it because I don't know much about Cornwall, but there is... has been for a long time a kind of Cornish independence movement.
Yes.
It says we should be on the level of like a Wales or a Scotland.
Sure.
Having a devolved government.
Yes.
Or a kind of just a kind of we have a certain separate status. The language is a huge part of that, I think.
Yeah. And
you hear some of it here.
Yes.
But I think you're right. Like it does ultimately convey a conservativeness.
Yes.
It's a film about people who, on the one hand, really want to defend kind of their culture and way of life, and I think you can understand why. But I think a corollary of that maybe is that it's very unfriendly.
Yes, though maybe we're strangers and foreigners and see it that way.
Yeah, well, I kind of agree. Yeah. It does feel weird to be on the side of the kind of middle class invaders. Like you kind of imagine you would want to be like, yes, protect who you are, fuck these guys. But
I'm not on the side. I mean, I think that, basically nobody watching the film can really be on the side of these particular wankers. I mean, I thought the father and the son were like abysmal. And there's something about the leading character that is just, he's such a wonderful presence in the film, with both that face that is kind of angry and solid and witty, I think, So I think I am with that character, except the film doesn't make me understand him, So for example, you can understand the experience of loss, you know, and kind of, yeah. So if he's somebody who's you know, sold his mother's house, I could understand why people might be regretful about that or sad about that. But actually, I think the film doesn't do enough to make you understand the reactions to it, really. I really don't. I mean, you know, he's not destitute, he's not homeless. Yeah, like, kind of, you know, I wish the film would have given you kind of more reasons why he feels this sense of loss and attack, right? Like, I
yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, what I was saying about his sort of, like I say, emotional legibility, I think is true, but it's a lot of it is through his performance, really.
Yeah,
I think his performance is wonderful, and it does have a kind of angry sort of stillness, and there are certain moments, like for instance when he goes into the pub and makes the kid fix the lobster trap.
Yes.
You know, because I mean, initially you
that I liked. I thought it was going to be much worse than that.
Yeah, so initially you think this could get quite ugly, you know, but then it turns out he's just making the kid fix it, and when the kid when he needs to tie a knot or something, he ties it because the kid obviously doesn't know how to. But just wrapping the rope around, preparing it all, it makes the kid do it, and he watches over him, and then he says thank you at the end. It's like that is the sort of. That's enough of a punishment at that point for this kid. You know, I suppose. I mean, because I kind of thought he might say, "You owe me 80 quid or whatever it is for the lobster."
Yes.
You know, which he doesn't. He doesn't demand money, but she just wants him to put that right. I think that was a really interesting little scene, and it's like that's kind of. I suppose there's also his status at play in there, because his status is someone in the community, and this kid is this newcomer, and so he doesn't need to kind of go overboard in punishing or humiliating this kid. Like, this is enough. The kid knows that he's been punished.
Yes. I don't know. I think the best things about the film to me were like the visuals.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about its aesthetic, what you made of it, because you immediately said afterwards, I need to find out what camera this was shot on.
Yes, so, you know, because I think it looks to me very strange and beautiful. Right, and then of course what you realize afterwards, or you know, trying to answer the question, why does it look so strange and beautiful? It was shot in 16mm, old stock, filmed with an old Bolex camera.
I do have something off the website here. Can
Okay.
I read this to you?
Sure.
Bait was captured on a 1976 16mm clockwork Bolex camera using 100-foot rolls of black and white Kodak stock, giving a maximum 28 seconds per shot. Shot with a single lens for a consistency of aesthetic. A total of 130 rolls or 13,000 feet of film was hand processed using an antique Bakelite rewind tank. There you go. There are two of these cameras.
So, and I think that pays off, you know, because it looks very beautiful and kind of strange. And sometimes it has those little flickers on the film, like old film stock does. And sometimes actually it has like a kind of a grain. Yeah.
And sometimes there'll be like a flash of overexposure and then it will return back.
So it has like this haunting quality that the film is already something in the past about a way of life that's gone, you know. So I very much loved all of that. It kind of it gives an eerie, kind of mournful ambiance to the narrative that you see in the film.
And I think then that what's shot with it, particularly that concentration, as we were talking about, on hands, feet, items, manual labour, has this effect of romanticising that kind of way of life.
Yes.
To a degree. And it's it's an interesting kind of romanticisation that focuses on kind of the dirty aspects, like the fact that this is hard, dirty work, but that is what makes it romantic.
But that's what makes it romantic. I mean, you know, because it's kind of the noble, salt of the earth kind of, you know, figure. They focus on manual labor. But also romanticism is always, or you know, very often about loss, right? You know, and this film
nostalgia
is about that. So
the aesthetic initially put me in mind of Cathy Come Home and that kind of like kind of 50s, 60s era of kind of British docudrama. Right. I think the titles really said that to me as well. There's a font and a kind of brightness to the way the titles come up and the credits at the end that speak to that. I mean, who knows to say sort of how deliberate that was, but that really conveyed it straight away. The first word that comes up in the film is the title, Bait, and just the way it looks when it comes up, and it's that shot of them going out to sea. really put me in mind of that. And so I suppose immediately I started thinking of that kind of thing, and then it's got me thinking about class, which is kind of all over the film.
Yes, it is. To me, what it made me think of was, early documentaries, experimentations with form, right? So, I think Mark mentioned John Grierson's, what's it called? His film on fishermen. But, also how an early cinema or early, by early documentary, I mean 30s, yeah. Well, maybe I shouldn't call it early documentary, but in 30s documentary, there was also kind of a lot of experimentation with form. So this feels a little bit like, John Griersonian documentary kind of mixed with Maya Deren in a way, right? Which is a compliment, yeah. So it has kind of the dreaminess of the Maya Deren, but it also has kind of like a documentary feel. It's kind of almost like documentary rendered kind of poetic or something. To me that's the loveliest part about the film, that it succeeds in evoking that.
Yeah, it kind of really beautifully conveys what it loves about its way of life, way of life.
That's right.
Those are the things that Mark mentioned.
Okay, so I thought he mentioned Grierson. Let me look it up.
Yeah. I mean, this is all stuff that I is just completely unfamiliar to me. Because Mark said, Mark sent me loads and loads of links. He's very good, Mark, and he knows his beans, and so he sent me lots and lots of links to things on Vimeo. Finis Terrae.
It's called Drifters.
Drifters. Oh, sorry, Drifters.
Yeah, it's about Britain's North Sea herring fishery, and so it's a documentary about that. And that's interesting to compare it to, because I understand that one of the things about this film also, in part of, so it has this fantastic work on the image, and then also it's all post-synced, so there's no direct sound, right?
Yes.
And so the combination of like a post-sync sound with the soundtrack, which does a lot of the work actually, of the film, yeah, kind of, sounds of the sea and kind of, fishing boats and so on. It immediately puts you into a world of fishing in a way that the images alone don't. So the sound does a lot of the work. But it's interesting, that all the dialogue is also like post-synced, yeah. Yeah. So I think that
I found some of it actually. Some of the Foley work early on I found quite overbearing. I think and it's in the manual labour stuff, cutting a rope or tying something. It's very, very crisp, clear sounds accompanying those images. But I think there was a period of adjustment as I got into the film more and kind of learned its style. That all started to come together for me, and I think I actually like the intensity of it. I think again that's really evocative. Can I just quickly say that Mark sent me all these links, and I told you he knows what he's doing. So he sent me links to Finis Terrae from 1928, Man of Iran 1934, Gardien de Phare, if that's the correct pronunciation, 1928, The Edge of the World 1937. All these things about coastal documentary and things. And then he said, so I haven't done it justice in the way he'd like. Worth spending a couple of minutes on each, in my opinion. Then you can mention me if you wish. So we haven't exactly, but I do need to mention it because
we can only mention what we know, and I have seen Drifters, and that's it really. So and I've seen Man of Iran. But of his list of films, those are the only two that I've seen. Yeah. And actually, I think for me, a film that it does evoke, though again, only partially or only tangentially, is really something like Luchino Visconti's Terra Trama. And again, so like if you're looking at this film on its own, and we must underline that, I think it works incredibly well, and I find it very beautiful. It's a very interesting film, and it worked on the audience absolutely. I think if you're measuring it against the very greatest films, it falls very short.
Yeah, sure, I agree. I tell you, put me in mind of The Bicycle Thieves as well, in the kind of there's a kind of means of production thing going on. It's kind of the thing about the boat. I need the boat. That means I can make more money. The thing about the lobster. That I need the lobster like because that's a source of money. Yes. And the bicycle in Bicycle Thieves has a similar sort of thing. And it probably would be going too far to describe this as a version of neo-realism, but I think it shares.
I think, it's interesting that in both our minds it's brought up neo-realist films, and completely understandably why it's done so. But again, I think, the comparison is worth keeping in mind because, the tragedy of Bicycle Thief is almost unbearable. It's so moving. It's, I think one of the greatest films ever, right? In the way that it moves you with that inevitability of loss and the tragedy that a simple thing can bring about to people who don't have very much. I never felt anything like that in this film.
No, I agree. I would say, though, that I found it very funny.
Yes, and it is.
And I think its humour comes out of that kind of slightly sarcastic place of it's maybe a little dark, maybe a little black, maybe almost a kind of gallows humour in this man's kind of fight against or kind of resistance to the change of his way of life and this sort of thing. I mean, it was a funny scene when he's just calling the guy a tourist, the husband this is, and the husband's trying to justify why it's okay for him to be there, and it sort of is okay for him to be there, but it's funny that he just won't hear it, It does have these funny moments, but I think that's kind of where they come out of.
There's something weird about that moment for me, because the Midlands Arts Centre where we saw the film is all full of like middle class people like ourselves, kind of watching this film, and they were completely laughing at these tourists who in many ways are them.
Yeah.
Right. So
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I didn't want to mention the word Brexit, but I think it's unavoidable because the kind of conservatism I was describing earlier about not wanting these outsiders to come in did speak to me in a kind of big way about a general kind of countrywide parochialism that says we don't want what's coming in. And I think the way that the entire country kind of has that attitude, it's not the same as the way Cornwall has it here. The entire country has it in more of a kind of don't take our jobs sort of way. It's not exactly the same, but it's equally unpleasant.
Yeah, though, I mean, there's that in the film as well. I mean, they are taking their jobs, they're taking their way of life, so they're bringing in, like, what do they call bed and breakfast or Airbnbs, and the pub is busy, but only in season, and there's like tourist attract boats have become like places to take tourists rather than, fish. And so kind of non-Cornish people are seen as the invaders, which, I mean, I just think there's a real kind of conservatism at the heart of all of those arguments. Yeah. And it manifests itself in, a real kind of anti-immigrant kind of ethos, forgetting, the nature of British immigration, in the rest of the world. Yeah. And in this case, kind of, just the mobility of labor force and the fact that everybody's way of life changes. I mean, one only has to kind of look at one's past and, and see, like, I mean, in some ways I don't recognize the world we live in from my childhood. I mean, kind of to imagine a world before computers or mobile phones or, or kind of people working just to subsist, right? Like, kind of, everything moves and everything changes, and this kind of adherence to a particular kind of way of life is like an untenable nostalgia, and to think that you somehow have a right to that way of life, that it's being stolen from you, is kind of mad entitlement.
Do you think the film suggests that it's an untenable thing to maintain this way of life?
No, I think the film doesn't. I think the film is on the side of the fishermen who are lost without that way of life.
And it says we can still be in charge of our own place in the world.
No, I'm not sure it says that. I think it says the implication is that they should be in charge, but they're not, clearly.
So, yeah, no, I agree with that. So, but then, so the question I'm asking, do you think the film suggests that it is tenable? Clearly it suggests that it should be, but do you think it suggests that it's kind of whatever is kind of tilting at windmills or whatever to try and maintain it, and that it's not possible. I don't know.
I mean, I think the film doesn't engage with that. I mean,
No.
you know, it doesn't go that far. You know, all we're shown is a way of life in the process of being lost, and people's mourning, resentment, and anger around that fact. It doesn't posit a way of recovering it, you know, or a way of overcoming it. You know, it certainly shows the tourist to be murderous.
Yeah. If accidentally.
Felt
Felt like an accident.
It clearly was an accident, but nonetheless, when you think of the progression of that line of argument, it's an accident for the character. It's not an accident for the film.
Well, no,
You know?
yeah.
So the film is really telling you that, you know, kind of these invaders are murderous. You know, they're not just stealing a way of life, you know, and being very entitled about it, you know, kind of, but, you know, fucking the locals and fucking them over and killing them. So, you know, so I think...
Reminds me of that thing of The Wizard of Oz being about a girl who kills a woman and then teams up with 3 strangers to kill again. It's one way of looking at it.
Well, but, you know, do you disagree?
No, I don't entirely disagree. I mean, I think the locals do, the newcomers, whatever their intentions may be, that's the effect that they have.
Exactly.
They come in and fuck things up.
Yeah, so...
Yeah.
So...
Yeah. Yes, let's think about the use of time in the film. It reminded me, it's something that Mark brought up, but it occurred to me, it reminded me of Don't Look Now, in fact.
Yeah.
The kind of the way in which time is not always presented entirely chronologically. The story is really told chronologically, but there is a certain kind of associative editing that is used that brings in flashes of things that I think you later discover are from the end of the film. Like the film starts off with these shots of the boat going out to sea, which is right at the very end in terms of the story, and also a shot of the young lad. Is it the brother's son?
Yes, it's the nephew.
The nephew,
the protagonist, yeah.
Who is the kid who dies, and you see a shot of him again quite early on in the film, dead with blood pooling at the back of his head. And at the start of the film, I'm thinking, you know, what does this relate? Because then clearly the brother doesn't have the two brothers. Don't have a good relationship for whatever reason. And I'm thinking, well, is this part of the reason? Has something happened in the past? But then, of course, you see this kid, so it's not all that clear. But what the film has done is taken shots and events and imagery from later on in the story and foregrounded it at the start. And it certainly creates a kind of disorienting effect. I'm not sure how purposeful it feels to me.
Yes, exactly. I liked it, but I also thought it was a bit crude. You know, like that. You know, it wasn't patterned enough, and it wasn't systemic enough, and also, you know, that some of the shots lasted just a bit too long in those elusive montages that you know the film often makes, and some of the symbolism I thought was you know, like the white ball and then the moon, you know. So
yeah, I suppose one of the things that it did do though in reminding me of Don't Look Now, and in Don't Look Now I was saying this relates to, in my reading at least, the Donald Sutherland character's state of mind. So the film, through its form, is putting you into his mind. Made me think, okay, so maybe that's kind of something that's going on here. Made me think of that. Made me think about that. And in that respect, it made me think of kind of the aesthetic of the film. Actually put me in mind of the film Pi by Darren Aronofsky. I don't know if you ever saw that.
no.
It's a again, black and white, very kind of crushed blacks and high contrast and shaken sort of grainy film and all that sort of stuff. Very kind of similar look in some ways. But that film is about a kind of mental claustrophobia, and sort of not trauma, but not even a mental problem that the guy has. But he's kind of, there's a kind of autistic aspect to it. He's kind of working on these mathematical formulas to make money in the stock market, that sort of thing. And he's one of those guys who's very inside his own head, and that's kind of what the film is. And I suppose that's not exactly what I thought of here, but it did bring up the idea to me of the main character here being or connected to the idea of him being kind of emotionally unavailable and kind of withdrawn and within himself and just happy with his own way of life and threatened by the changes.
I mean,
I suppose what you're saying as well about the film's aesthetic conveying that nostalgia of the past. Of the film. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, the idea that the film already looks like it's an artifact of the past. I think that's true, and I think that may be part of it.
Yes, I mean, I think the lead character is very appealing, because on the one hand, he's depicted as that kind of independent, salt of the earth person, really highly skilled, right? Because when we think of manual labor, we don't tend to think of it as being highly skilled, and yet, of course, people like farmers and fishermen and so on are really highly skilled. It takes a lifetime to develop the skills that they have, right? So, those are kind of the appealing aspect. The other appealing aspect is this is a man who can survive, right? So he's lost the boat, he's fishing in his own way, but he's still selling his fish and scrabbling a living independently, and delivering fish, to all those doorways that he does every morning. Which at some point I thought, are these fish that he sold, or is this, the way that, for example, my family sometimes when you go to the allotment, you bring back courgettes or tomatoes and you deliver them to all your family on the way, right? So that wasn't clear to me whether, are these fish deliveries that he lives hanging on the door, are they sales or are they family? Right.
To me, they look like sales.
I thought
that was the impression I got.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards that interpretation. And if it is, here's this man who basically has nothing. He's lost his fishing boat and whatever, but can still scrabble a living off the land or off the sea. Yeah, he's still independent. He's not working for anybody else. Now, the things that I don't get is why he's so angry with his brother that he's making a living taking tourists around, right? Like, it's somehow as if there's a holy purpose, that boats have to be for fishing and you desecrate them or something when you're using them for. I don't get that at all, and frankly, nothing is preventing the brother from, taking around tourists dressed as dicks, in the summer and kind of fishing in the winter, or fishing out of season, or like kind of like there are moments in the film that I just think are not
there's
intelligible.
There's a kind of gatekeeping aspect to it, which is sort of to say, if this is the way we should live, and if you're adapting to it the way you are,
you're selling out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does he even use that phrase at one point?
I think he does, actually. Or something like it, But there's
something like it. Well, I think it might be to the pub owner actually, when he talks about her closing the pub in winter or something.
Yeah, your husband would never have done that.
Yeah, he would never have sold out or something like that.
Yeah.
So he's very judgmental about the way other people in his community are adapting. In a way, I think the film considers him a hero for that, for wanting to keep that way of life.
That's right.
Changing.
I think the film does, and I think that's one of my problems with the film.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
So anyway,
do you have any other places to go?
I think the only thing I would say is because we've been speaking, I think, the last little while, at least in measured terms or negatively. And actually, I just want to go back to this idea that this is indeed a very interesting and important film, and that I do think that people should see it.
I think it is beautifully evocative of the way of life that it depicts, and I think it's very effective at getting you to understand this particular man as well. I do think that the middle class family are too much of a caricature, essentially, and I think I would have liked there to have been more nuance in that.
And on the other hand, the way of filming, the look of the film, the use of sound, the formal play and experimentation with all of that, coupled with how the audience received it, which it was with it all the way, is both admirable and encouraging.
Yeah. It's also full frame, which is really neither here nor there, but that's a contributor to that Cathy Come Home look I was talking about, I think. Like, that aspect of the past thing.
Right.
Back when TVs were black and white and we listened to the World Service.
Thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
iTunes, SoundCloud and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com. And thanks again to Mark for his thoughts.
Yes, indeed.
And
thank you for
for giving
listening.
me loads and loads of links to loads of boring black and white fishing movies.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye bye.